You have seen it on the news. It is happening all over the world. Surging electricity prices, gasoline and natural gas prices going up, food prices going up too. Even the price of the drink Aperol Spritz is going up. When the price of everything goes up, we call it inflation. And inflation has never been so high in Western countries for decades. In the US, for example, inflation is above 6% for the year 2021, something that we had never seen since 1990. You may now wonder why all of that is happening right now, and most importantly, you may wonder what does inflation mean for you, the consumer? Those are all the questions we're going to address in this episode of Money Talk. Let's dive in. So, maybe I have been a little bit over dramatic before because inflation is so high right now because the prices in 2020 were very low. Let me explain. In 2020, because of the lockdowns, the demand for almost all products went down significantly, except the demand for toilet paper and Netflix. Anyways, the demand for products in 2020 was very low, which reduces the price of almost everything. It reduced the price of airline tickets, oil, cars, etc. So much so that during a brief period, oil had a negative price. It means that people would give you money to buy oil. All that goes to say that the inflation rate that we see today in 2021 is deceiving. People tell you, for example, that oil went up by 50% compared to 2020. Well, yes, that is true, but in 2020 it was very low. When we compare the price of oil between 2021 and 2019, it is more or less the same price. The same goes for other items, such as airline tickets and so on. But still, even after we made this rectification, the price of most items is going up. Stuff is getting more expensive. And worst of all, the inflation that we're seeing right now might be enough to start an inflation spiral. But before we talk about the inflation spiral, why does inflation happen? Inflation can have 4 different origins. Let's start with the first origin, cost push inflation, which is why we're having inflation today in 2021. Cost push inflation takes place because something that is used very extensively to produce products got more expensive. It can be labor, energy, or some commodities. A good example is the 1970s, when America and Europe and other countries in the planet went through the Great Inflation. What started the Great Inflation is the sudden increase of the price of oil. And since everything depended on oil back then to be produced and then taken to the consumer, the price of all the products in the economy went up. The price of gasoline obviously went up, but also the price of other items, even the price of food went up, because food needed to be taken there by a truck, a boat, or a plane that uses oil. That price increase was enough to start an inflation spiral that devastated the US and Europe with double-digit inflation rates. We can say that the inflation of 2021 is also a cost-push inflation, but it's very different though than the inflation of the 1970s. The inflation we're seeing now is not because something like oil got more expensive, but rather because supply chains got more expensive. Here's a problem with supply chains. In 2020, the companies expected the pandemic to last for years and years, and they thought that the demand for product was going to remain low in 2021, 2022, and so forth. As a result, they laid off a lot of people, they disposed of a lot of machines, and they even closed several manufacturing plants. But in 2021, the demand for products was much higher than expected. Suddenly, all those companies had to face a huge demand that they could not satisfy anymore. And as you can imagine, rehiring employees, buying again the old machines, and opening again manufacturing plants takes time and money. That is why a lot of manufacturers right now cannot satisfy this big and unexpected demand. And when the demand goes up and the supply goes down, what happens? Prices go up. The second reason why the price of everything is going up is also because it has become difficult to take the products from the factory to the consumers. Microchips are a perfect example of that problem. They didn't expect such a demand for microchips in 2021, so they produced very little microchips. So right now there is a huge shortage of microchips. The price of microchips absolutely went through the roof, and right now a lot of products that use microchips, such as cars or other products, cannot be made. Because in our globalized economy, the place where the product is manufactured may be very far away from the place where the end consumer is. There's a whole supply chain of boats, airplanes, and trucks to bring that product to the consumer. Once again, the pandemic and the lockdowns of 2020 are the direct reason why the supply chains today are simply not working. In 2020, a lot of old airplanes and old boats were retired without being replaced. The same thing goes for truck drivers, pilots, and captains. A lot of them retired early or were simply laid off. The case of pilots is very telling. There is right now a huge shortage of pilots. And that doesn't happen because older pilots already retired and don't want to come back, but also very few people made the studies to become pilots in 2020. I mean, who would want to become a pilot in 2020 when you read in the newspaper that all major airlines are going bankrupt? Doesn't make sense. All of that goes to say that the inflation that we're living right now is a cost-push inflation, a double cost-push inflation. Number one, there's not enough supply, and number two, the logistics to get the supply to the end consumer have become more expensive. The second type of inflation is monetary inflation. That happens when the government prints too much money. That may happen because they want to pay a lot of national debt or they have big deficits or whatever. Because the government increases enormously the supply of money automatically loses its value and everything becomes more expensive. That is exactly what is happening right now in Venezuela, where the government has a huge deficit and it has no other option than printing money to compensate that deficit. It is also what happened in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. And it is also something that may happen today in the US and in Europe. Don't worry, we're going to talk more about that later. The third type of inflation is called the demand pull inflation. That happens when the economy is going 100,000%, when everybody has a job and suddenly all that demand cannot be satisfied by the production of the country. As a result, prices go up. But that kind of inflation has not been seen for quite a while. It's not the inflation that is happening right now, so let's skip it. And last but not least, the fourth type of inflation is actually the most important type of inflation. It is inflation caused by expectations. That may sound crazy, but inflation caused by expectations simply happen because people believe there's going to be inflation in the future. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because people today believe that inflation is going to take place in the future, inflation takes place now. I know, it sounds crazy, but you will understand it a little bit later. Now that you know everything about the four types of inflation and that you got a little bit of a history course on the 1970s and the Weimar Republic, never expected I would become a history teacher. So as I said earlier, the inflation we're having right now is cost-push inflation caused by the low supply and logistics problems. Well, when manufacturers will be able to meet the demand again and when the logistics will be working correctly again, inflation is going to go away, right? Unfortunately, no. Even if production goes back to its normal level and the logistics of the supply chains work again, inflation might already be in what we call an inflation spiral. Here's the thing. Inflation is what we call a positive feedback loop. It means that the consequences of inflation are going to bring even more inflation that will bring even more consequences, and the loop is going to feed back herself into infinity. Now we're having a cost-push inflation because now everybody knows about inflation, everybody saw it on the news, you're watching this video, everybody knows about it. What do? They think, hey, you know what? I'm going to buy the most I can right now when it's still cheap because you know what? In the future, it's going to be more expensive. Since a lot of people will use exactly the same logic, a lot of people are going to rush to buy as much as possible. But this increase in demand is going to increase the price, which makes inflation even worse. And all the people who have a job and a salary, which means what? 90% of the population will ask for a salary increase to compensate the loss of purchasing power. And if the company they work for accepts to raise the salary, they will have no other choice but to increase the price of their products to compensate the hike in salary. That price increase is going to generate even more inflation. That extra inflation is going to give an incentive to people to buy even more stuff right now, which will generate even more inflation, and the cycle goes on and on and on. That is how an inflation spiral works. An inflation that was originally a cost-push inflation becomes an expectation inflation. The fourth type of inflation we talked about previously, remember? And that is why even if the supply chain problem is fixed, inflation might continue, and continue. And that is also what happened in the 1970s in the US. Originally, the inflation started because of an increase in the price of oil, but then it became an expectation inflation. That's what economists are worried about today. They're scared that we're going to enter in the same dynamics that in the 1970s. And to make matters even worse, governments right now are printing money like crazy, like there was no tomorrow, which might put even more fuel on the inflation fire. We might have an inflation that is cost-push inflation, expectancy inflation, and monetary inflation. What a sad package. The prospect that we're facing right now seems pretty grim. But what could be done? What could be done to stop inflation? There is only one medicine that can stop inflation. And believe me, it's not soft medicine. It is a very big and hard to swallow pill. Even worse than those huge Dafalgon pills that get stuck in the middle of the throat. The only real way to take out inflation is increasing the interest rate. Increase massively the interest rate. Interest rates depend directly on the amount of money that there is in the economy. If there is more money in the economy, the interest rate is going to be slower. If there is less money into the economy, the interest rate is going to be higher. And even though high interest rates may take out inflation, they have quite a few drawbacks too. Imagine that suddenly the interest rate right now goes to 10 or 15%. That would put you in a very difficult situation because everything that has to do with money becomes more expensive. The credit card debt that you have, for example, your mortgage, everything becomes more expensive. So as a result, you consume less products. And the same goes for businesses. They will invest less money because suddenly, if the interest rate was 15%, they would not build that beautiful, big manufacturing plant that they had in mind because the debt that is necessary to build it suddenly became much more expensive. They would probably drop any investment project. As a result, they hire less people. And I think you understand where all of that is going. If companies hire less people, if people consume less products, what happens? Well, unemployment goes up massively. I told you it was a hard pill to swallow. Tough medicine. Joe Biden, Christine Lagarde, and van der Leyen will have to take a very tough decision. They either will have high inflation rates or high unemployment rates. And that's no easy decision. It's a very tough decision. What would you say yourself? What do you think is worse? Inflation rate or unemployment rate? If you were Joe Biden right now, what would you choose? Would you choose to have high inflation or high unemployment? Let me know in the comment. Historically, politicians always prefer to have a high inflation rate because inflation is perceived as less painful by the population. People prefer to keep their jobs and buy a more expensive ice cream than being unemployed and have a cheap ice cream, which makes sense. And to add up to all of this, all those politicians, they absolutely want to conduct those trillion-dollar stimulus packages. And they have no other choice than printing money to finance those huge packages. This huge amount of extra money, which will increase inflation even more because of monetary inflation. The only way to finance those packages without printing a lot of money would be to increase taxes dramatically. And the only fast and reliable way to raise money via taxes is increasing the taxes on lower and middle incomes, which would be total political suicide. So nope, politicians are not going to increase taxes, at least not in the short term. More about that in that video. So you get the pictures. Politicians have two options: accept inflation or take very unpopular decisions to combat inflation. So very likely they're gonna choose option number one, which is embrace inflation. Now that inflation seems pretty much unavoidable, you may wonder, what does inflation mean for me? What are the consequences for me, the everyday person? And what can I do against inflation? Well, the biggest losers every time when there is inflation are people who save money. The purchasing power of their saving is going down, down, and down, just like snow melting at the sun. And all the people who receive some kind of fixed income are also the biggest losers when there is high inflation. That may be retired people who receive the government retirement program, or that may be people who are out of the workforce for a reason or another and live off the social system, or the people who invested a lot of money in bonds and live off the interest of the bonds. All those people will have the same problem. Their purchasing power out of their income is going to diminish slowly but steadily. Those are the two biggest losers, savers and fixed income earners. But if you, like most people, you receive a salary, you are in a little bit better position because more likely than not, your salary is also going to go up to somehow compensate the inflation. But still, your salary raise is certainly not going to compensate the inflation. And this meme that got viral explains it perfectly. And that may sound weird, but the biggest winners when there is high inflation are those people who have debts. Yes, you heard me right. Those people who have debts. People who have debts are the biggest winner because the real value of the debt is also decreasing with inflation. The interest payment that they have to do is also decreasing with inflation. Imagine that you have $100,000 worth of debt and the interest rate on that debt is 10%. You have a yearly interest payment of $10,000. And now imagine that we are in 2019, before the inflation, and you have a yearly salary of $40,000. The interest payment represents 25% of your salary. That's pretty high. That's bad. You're sad. But in 2022, when there is inflation, imagine that your salary got up to $80,000. But in the meantime, when inflation was high, your debt is still $100,000 and your interest payment is still $10,000. In that case, the interest payment represents 12.5% of your salary. Your debt burden is much lower than in 2019, and as a result, you are happy. Do you see now how inflation actually reduces the debt burden? So that was all for this video about inflation. I hope that you liked this video and learned something from it. If that is the case, a little thumbs up is always appreciated. If there is something you want me to comment or talk about in a future video, you can send me an email to the address that is in the description below. And I will see you very soon for the next episode. In the meantime, take care.